2 in the morning on the 8th of March, 2026, the Arabian Sea was a vast sheet of black glass under a moonless sky, the air thick with the humid, salt-heavy weight of the tropical night. 500 miles to the north, the Iranian coastline remained a jagged silhouette against the stars, hidden behind a veil of heat haze. The amphibious assault ship USS Bataan moved at a steady 15 knots, its massive hull cutting through the dark water with a rhythmic, low-frequency thrum that vibrated through the steel decks. High above on the bridge, the green glow of the radar repeaters illuminated the faces of the watchstanders in a ghostly light. The atmosphere was one of professional routine, the quiet hum of air conditioning, the only sound until the world shifted on its axis. Exactly 2 minutes after the hour, a high-velocity thermal signature erupted from a mobile launcher hidden in the coastal mountains of the Hormozgan Province. The Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missile cleared its canister in a gout of white-hot flame that could be seen from space. It accelerated instantly, its solid-fuel rocket motor screaming as it tore through the lower atmosphere at speeds exceeding Mach 3. On the Aegis display of the escorting destroyer, the USS Mason, a single red diamond appeared, moving with a terrifying linearity toward the center of the screen. The tactical action officer shouted the alarm, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade as the ship's automated systems began the frantic transition to a combat footing. The missile reached the apex of its brief, parabolic flight at an altitude of 30 kilometers before tilting its nose downward for the terminal phase. On the deck of the assault ship, the primary flight control officers had less than 45 seconds to react as the close-in weapon systems began to slew toward the northern horizon. The automated 20mm Gatling guns groaned as they searched for the incoming threat, their sensors blinded by the steep angle of the missile's ballistic descent. At 2 hours and 4 minutes past midnight, the Fateh 110 missile reappeared on the infrared sensors, a white-hot needle dropping out of the clouds at a 60-degree angle. The USS Mason launched 2 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles in a desperate attempt to intercept, the interceptors trailing plumes of orange fire as they raced into the dark. One interceptor missed by less than 50 meters, its proximity fuse failing to trigger in the wake of the ballistic missile's shockwave. The second interceptor clipped the tail fins of the Fateh, but it was not enough to alter the terminal trajectory of the half-ton high-explosive warhead. The impact occurred on the port side of the USS Bataan, just forward of the island superstructure and 3 meters above the waterline. The kinetic energy alone was enough to peel back the heavy steel plating like wet paper before the warhead detonated inside the hangar deck. A massive fireball, fueled by the volatile mixture of jet fuel and magnesium flares, erupted from the side of the ship, lighting up the Arabian Sea for miles in every direction. The sound of the explosion was a singular, bone-shaking crack that shattered the windows of the bridge and threw sailors across the deck like ragdolls. Inside the hangar, the pressure wave shredded 3 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, tossing the 5-ton aircraft into the bulkheads and crushing several maintenance crews instantly. The ship groaned, a deep, metallic scream of protesting steel, as the structural frame absorbed the shock of the blast. Within seconds, thick, acrid black smoke began to billow from the jagged hole in the hull, the smell of burning rubber and hydraulic fluid filling the passageways. The Bataan began a slow, sickening roll to the port side, the deck tilting as thousands of tons of seawater began to pour into the lower compartments through the ruptured seams. On the bridge, the commanding officer clung to the edge of the command chair as the ship listed to 5 degrees. The internal communications went dead for 5 long seconds before the emergency circuit kicked in, filling the air with the frantic reports of fire and flooding from every deck. The salt air, once cool and quiet, was now choked with the heat of the inferno and the screaming of the ship's internal alarms. The USS Bataan, the centerpiece of the regional amphibious ready group, was no longer a platform for power projection, but a wounded giant fighting for its life in the dark. At 2:15 in the morning, the interior of the USS Bataan was a hellscape of flickering red emergency lights, and the deafening roar of fire suppression systems fighting a losing battle against the inferno. Thick, oily smoke, the byproduct of burning JP-5 aviation fuel and composite airframe materials, moved through the passageways like a living thing, choking any sailor caught without a breathing apparatus. On the hangar deck, The damage control teams moved with a practiced, mechanical urgency. Their yellow and red jerseys stained black with soot and hydraulic fluid. The deck beneath their boots was slick with a dangerous mixture of seawater, foam, and oil, tilting at a steady 5-degree angle that made every movement a struggle against gravity. The primary damage control officer, a lieutenant commander with 15 years of experience, stood at the edge of the blast zone, his voice straining against the sound of the emergency pumps. He directed the flow of 200 sailors toward the jagged breach in the portside hull, where the twisted remains of a bulkhead were glowing a dull, angry orange from the residual heat. The temperature in the immediate vicinity of the impact zone had soared to over 1,000 degrees, causing the very paint on the walls to bubble and peel away in large, toxic flakes. The smell was an overwhelming cocktail of ozone, scorched meat, and the sharp, chemical bite of the aqueous film-forming foam being sprayed in massive quantities. The structural integrity of the ship was the primary concern. The Fateh 110 missile had punched through the heavy steel of the hull and detonated near a major structural support pillar, leaving a hole 10 meters wide. Every time the Bataan encountered a significant swell, the ship groaned a deep, metallic shrieking sound that vibrated through the soles of the sailors' boots. Engineering reported that the portside list had stabilized at 5 degrees for the moment, but the rate of flooding in the lower storage compartments remained at 4,000 gallons per minute. Repair locker crews worked in waist-deep water, hammering wooden plugs and steel shoring into the smaller cracks to slow the sea's relentless entry. The casualty report coming into the primary aid station was grim. 12 sailors had been confirmed killed in the initial explosion, most of them part of the maintenance crews working on the MH-60 Sierra helicopters in the hangar. Another 38 personnel were being treated for severe burns and smoke inhalation, their bodies laid out on the deck of the mess line, which had been converted into a triage center. The medical corpsmen worked in the dim light, their hands steady despite the constant shuddering of the ship, as the escorting destroyer, the USS Mason, fired its 5-inch gun at distant, unidentified surface contacts. Despite the chaos, the discipline of the United States Navy remained unbroken. There was no shouting of panic, only the rhythmic cadence of damage control reports and the steady hiss of the fire hoses. Teams of 4 worked in unison to drag the wreckage of a destroyed aircraft away from the firefighting efforts, their boots splashing through the rising water. They were racing against time. If the fire reached the secondary ammunition elevator, located only 20 meters aft of the impact site, the Bataan would face a catastrophic secondary explosion that no amount of foam could quench. On the flight deck above, the salt spray was whipped into a frenzy by the wind and the rotor wash of the remaining helicopters. The deck was a hive of activity as the crew struggled to move the remaining F-35 Bravo Lightning jets toward the starboard side to balance the ship's weight. The air was cold and sharp compared to the furnace below, but the sky remained a terrifying, empty black. Somewhere out in that darkness, the Iranian launchers were likely reloading, and the crew of the Bataan knew that they were a sitting target, trailing a massive plume of smoke across the Arabian Sea. 2:30 in the morning, on the 8th of March, 2026, the Arabian Sea was no longer a silent void, but a theater of high-intensity electronic warfare and kinetic interception. The air around the destroyer USS Mason was thick with the scent of ozone and the sharp, metallic tang of burnt propellant. To the south, the USS Bataan remained a jagged silhouette of orange flame and black smoke, a beacon that was now drawing more than just the attention of the rescue crews. The radar screens inside the Mason's Combat Information Center were suddenly cluttered with dozens of small, slow-moving returns, appearing like a cloud of digital locusts on the AN/SPY-6 radar display. The threat was identified within seconds as a swarm of 30 one-way attack drones, launched from concealed positions along the Iranian coastline. These low-cost, propeller-driven munitions were designed to overwhelm a ship's defenses through sheer numbers, flying just 20 meters above the wave tops to mask their approach within the sea clutter. The tactical action officer on the Mason did not hesitate, immediately declaring a weapons-free status for the forward and aft sectors. The destroyer accelerated to 30 knots, its bow cutting through the 2-meter swells and throwing curtains of white spray over the forward deck. as it moved to position itself between the crippled Bataan and the incoming swarm. The defense began with the deep, rhythmic thud of the Mark 41 vertical launch system. From the forward cells, 4 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles erupted into the night sky, their rocket motors casting a blinding white glare across the superstructure of the Mason. These missiles were the first line of defense, guided by the ship's fire control illumination, to intercept the lead elements of the drone swarm at a range of 15 kilometers. The missiles streaked across the horizon, their flight paths intersecting with the slow-moving targets in a series of brief, bright flashes that illuminated the sea for a fraction of a second before the debris fell into the dark water. As the remaining drones closed the distance to within 5 kilometers, the Mason's 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun joined the engagement. The gun turret slewed with predatory speed, firing high-explosive, proximity-fused rounds at a rate of 20 shells per minute. Each detonation in the air sent a cloud of tungsten shrapnel tearing through the flimsy fiberglass airframes of the drones, shredding wings and engines with surgical precision. The sound was a continuous, heavy pounding that vibrated through the hull of the destroyer, a physical manifestation of the United States Navy's defensive doctrine. By 2:40 in the morning, the swarm had been reduced to less than 10 targets, but the drones were now within the inner tier of the defense. The Phalanx close-in weapon system on the port side of the Mason came to life, its 20mm Gatling gun spinning up to 4,500 rounds per minute. The sound was not a series of shots, but a continuous, mechanical scream that echoed across the water. A stream of armor-piercing tracer rounds reached out into the darkness, tracking the erratic movements of a drone as it attempted a terminal dive toward the Mason's bridge. The drone disintegrated in a mid-air fireball less than 800 meters from the ship, its fragments skipping across the surface of the water like stones. The coordination between the Mason and the crippled Bataan was a testament to the professionalism of the crews involved. Despite the smoke in the list, the Bataan's own electronic warfare suites were active, projecting powerful jamming signals that disrupted the GPS guidance of the incoming threats. 2 of the drones were seen to veer wildly off course, their internal logic scrambled by the intense electromagnetic interference before they plunged harmlessly into the sea. The defense was systematic, layered, and cold-bloodedly efficient, turning the intended massacre into a one-sided demonstration of technological superiority. By 2:50 in the morning, the radar screens were clear. The final tally of the engagement was 28 drones, confirmed destroyed by kinetic impact, and 2 neutralized by electronic soft kill measures. The USS Mason had successfully held the line, preventing a second catastrophic strike on the Bataan, while the assault ship's crew continued their desperate fight against the fires below. The ocean was littered with the floating remnants of the Iranian swarm, but the threat was far from over. The crew of the Mason remained at general quarters, their eyes fixed on the northern horizon, waiting for the inevitable escalation that was sure to follow the rising sun. 3 in the morning on the 8th of March, 2026, the Arabian Sea had turned into a chaotic expanse of white-capped waves and swirling mist, driven by a strengthening wind that carried the sharp, biting scent of brine and burnt oil. On the flight deck of the USS Bataan, the situation remained precarious. The ship was still maintaining a list of 5 degrees to the port side, making every aircraft movement a high-stakes gamble against the laws of physics. Despite the tilt and the intermittent plumes of smoke still rising from the hangar bay, the Air Department worked with grim determination to establish a defensive bubble around the wounded ship. The immediate concern for the strike group commander was the possibility of a subsurface follow-up attack from Iranian Ghadir-class midget submarines known to operate in these shallow coastal waters. To counter this threat, 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters were cleared for an immediate emergency launch from the crippled assault ship, moving at a reduced speed of 10 knots. The flight deck crews, wearing their green and purple jerseys, braced themselves against the wind as they removed the heavy tie-down chains from the rotorcraft. The first helicopter, call sign Hunter 7-1, lifted off the pitching deck at 3:15 in the morning, the pilot using every bit of the twin-engine power to clear the superstructure. The landing gear missed the edge of the flight deck by less than 2 meters as the ship rolled in a heavy swell. Once airborne, the helicopter transitioned into a low-altitude hover. Its powerful searchlights cut through the dark water to search for the telltale wake of a periscope. The salt spray whipped into a fine mist by the downwash of the four-bladed main rotor. 5 miles to the north, the USS Mason adjusted its position and deployed its multi-function towed array sonar, a long cable of hydrophones stretching hundreds of meters behind the ship. Inside the Mason sonar suite, the technicians sat in near darkness, their ears tuned to the rhythmic pings of the active sonar and the low-frequency hum of distant engines. At 3:45 in the morning, Punter, 7-1, began a systematic pattern of dropping sonobuoys into the water, each small canister deploying a sensitive underwater microphone. The tactical coordinator in the back of the helicopter watched the waterfall displays on his screen, his eyes scanning for frequency lines indicating an electric motor or a cavitating propeller. The Mason continued to cycle its radar through frequency bands to counter jamming, the air thick with invisible sensor energy forming a digital wall to protect the Bataan. Every sailor on watch felt the vibration of the ship's engines through the soles of their boots, a constant reminder of the mechanical effort required to keep the strike group moving. By 4 in the morning, helicopters created a 10-mile sanitization zone around the Bataan, while the Mason provided a high-altitude umbrella of anti-air coverage. Fuel and ammunition were prioritized for the defensive units, while the damage control teams on the Bataan continued their struggle below the waterline. The drone swarm crisis had passed, but tension remained as the strike group prepared for the transition from a defensive posture to a coordinated retaliatory strike. 4 in the morning, on the 8th of March, 2026. The Arabian Sea was a cauldron of gray mist and white-capped swells, the air saturated with the smell of salt and the heavy, metallic stench of burning aviation fuel. On the flight deck of the USS Bataan, the orange glow of the internal fires cast long, dancing shadows across the remaining F-35 Bravo Lightning jets. The ship was still listing at 5 degrees, but the mission had shifted from survival to retaliation. The strike group commander had authorized a precision strike against the coastal batteries in Hormozgan Province that had launched the Fateh 110 missile. 2 F-35 Bravo fighters, their stealth coating shimmering under the deck lights, taxied toward the short takeoff ramp with their engines producing a low-frequency roar that vibrated through the hull. The lead pilot, call sign Blade 0-1, adjusted his helmet-mounted display as the jet reached the launch position. The heat from the lift fan blasted against the non-skid surface of the deck, creating a shimmering distortion in the humid air. At exactly 4:15 in the morning, the deck officer signaled the launch. The F-35 Bravo accelerated with a deafening, earth-shaking scream, the engine's 12,000 pounds of thrust pushing the aircraft up the ramp and into the dark sky. The second jet followed 20 seconds later, both aircraft disappearing into the clouds as they climbed toward 20,000 feet, their internal weapon bays holding the coordinates of the enemy launchers. 20 minutes later, the two fighters reached the Iranian coastline. The sky over the mountains was a deep, bruised purple, the first hint of dawn beginning to touch the eastern horizon. Blade 0-1 transitioned to a combat-ready state, his sensors identifying the thermal bloom of 2 mobile missile launchers. Parked in a narrow canyon at coordinates 27 degrees 12 minutes north, 56 degrees 18 minutes east, the enemy crews were in the process of reloading, their support vehicles clustered around the massive launch rails. The trigger was squeezed. Blade 0-1 released a single 1,000-pound GBU-32 Joint Direct Attack munition from the internal bay. The bomb dropped into the cold air, its GPS-guided fins snapping open with a mechanical click as it began its terminal descent. The weapon shrieked through the atmosphere, a dark shape trailing a thin line of condensation that blotted out the stars for 3 full seconds. The physical shock of the release caused the fighter jet to lurch upward, the pilot immediately banking into a steep turn to maintain visual contact with the target area. The warhead punched straight through the reinforced cab of the primary mobile launcher, detonating the volatile solid-fuel rocket motor stored on the rail. A fireball of blinding white light bleached the sky, a detonation so powerful it cracked the eardrums of the Iranian personnel 300 meters away. The turret of the launcher was sent flying into the canyon wall, 6 tons of mangled steel rising 30 meters before it fell back and crushed a fuel truck. The second launcher was caught in the secondary blast, its tires melting instantly as the shock wave compressed every chest in the vicinity. Black smoke boiled out of the canyon, rising in a dense column that reached 500 feet in seconds. The defending side reacted with desperate chaos. A nearby HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery erupted into life, its radar dish slewing wildly toward the sky. 2 interceptor missiles were launched in quick succession, their white smoke streaks tearing across the purple dawn. Blade 0-1 kicked the rudder hard left, wrenching the nose of the F-35 away from the rising fire, while his electronic warfare suite flooded the enemy radar with false returns. The first interceptor exploded in a single white flash 500 meters behind the jet, debris scattering across the jagged rocks before the largest pieces hit the canyon floor. The canyon was now a graveyard of burning rubber and scorched metal, the silence of the desert shattered by the overlapping screams of the survivors. The secondary explosions from the ammunition truck continued to ripple through the valley, sending sparks of orange light into the thickening smoke. Blade 0-1 banked his aircraft toward the open sea, his wingman following close behind. The threat from the coastal battery had been obliterated, leaving only the sound of the wind and the crackle of the inferno behind them as they raced back toward the carrier strike group. 5 in the morning on the 8th of March, 2026, the first light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, turning the Arabian Sea into a vast, bruised expanse of steel-gray water. The fires aboard the USS Bataan had been reduced to a smoldering, toxic heat, but the air around the ship remained thick with the smell of scorched metal and the chemical bite of firefighting foam. The ship's list had been corrected to 3 degrees after the engineering department counter-flooded several compartments on the starboard side, a delicate operation that required moving thousands of tons of fuel and ballast water in total darkness. The focus of the strike group now shifted from kinetic combat to the grueling reality of logistics and medical survival. On the flight deck, a 3-ship formation of MH-60 Sierra helicopters from the escorting cruiser were idling, their rotors creating a rhythmic, low-frequency thrum that echoed off the superstructure. These aircraft were being prepared for a critical casualty evacuation mission. The most severely wounded sailors, those with third-degree burns and internal blast injuries, were being stabilized in the Bataan's primary medical bay before being moved to the flight deck. The logistics of moving 42 critically injured personnel from a listing ship in a combat zone required the precision of a surgical operation. Each sailor was secured in a Stokes litter, a specialized metal basket designed for shipboard extraction, and hoisted through the smoke-filled passageways by teams of 4. The medical corpsmen worked in the dim emergency lighting, their gloved hands covered in soot and blood as they monitored portable oxygen tanks and intravenous drips. By 5:30 in the morning, the first helicopter lifted off the deck, banking toward a regional medical facility in Oman, located 300 kilometers to the west. At coordinates 18 degrees 32 minutes north, 61 degrees 55 minutes east, the arrival of the deep-sea salvage tug, the USNS Apache, provided the first real hope for the Bataan's long-term survival. As the tug drew alongside the Bataan, the crew on the forward deck prepared the heavy towing hawser's steel cables the thickness of a man's wrist, capable of withstanding hundreds of thousands of pounds of tension. The connection process was executed in 4-meter swells, with the 2 massive ships moving in parallel at a speed of only 3 knots. A pneumatic line-throwing gun was used to fire a lead line across the gap, which was then used to pull the heavy steel hawser onto the Bataan's forecastle. Once the connection was secured, the Apache began to take the strain, its massive diesel engines producing 40,000 horsepower to stabilize the Bataan's heading and prevent the ship from drifting further toward the Iranian coast. Logistics also meant the immediate replenishment of the USS Mason's defensive stores. A supply ship, the USNS Arctic, was already closing in from the south to conduct an underway replenishment. The transfer of ammunition at sea is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in naval operations, involving the movement of 1,000-pound missile canisters across a high line between 2 ships moving at 12 knots. By 6 in the morning, the transition was complete. The Bataan was under tow, the wounded were in the air, and the strike group's defensive umbrella was being refueled and rearmed. The wounded giant was moving, slowly but surely, toward safety. But the morning mist was thickening, and the tactical screens were beginning to show a new, ominous set of returns. 6:30 in the morning on the 8th of March, 2026. The Arabian Sea was draped in a thick, low-lying blanket of morning mist that reduced visibility to less than 1 kilometer. The sun was a pale, indistinct disk of white light, struggling to penetrate the haze, casting a flat, silver glow over the churning water. The USS Bataan, still tethered to the USNS Apache by a massive steel hawser, moved through the waves at a sluggish 6 knots. The smell of the ocean was now mixed with the heavy, damp scent of the fog and the lingering, sulfurous odor of the earlier missile strike. The silence of the morning was deceptive, broken only by the rhythmic splashing of the sea against the hull and the distant, muffled thrum of the destroyer's engines. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Mason, the tension had reached a new peak. The ANSPY-6 radar was operating in a specialized surface search mode, burning through the atmospheric interference to scan the waves for low-profile threats. At 6:45, the radar technicians identified a series of 20 small, high-speed returns emerging from the coastal waters to the northeast. These were not the slow-moving drones of the earlier engagement. These were Iranian fast attack craft, heavily armed, highly maneuverable vessels capable of speeds exceeding 50 knots. They were moving in a pincer formation, utilizing the fog to mask their approach as they closed the distance to the crippled Bataan. The IRGC Navy fast attack craft were equipped with multiple rocket launchers and long-range anti-ship missiles, designed specifically for swarming tactics against larger naval platforms. As they reached a range of 15 kilometers, the lead boats began to accelerate, their powerful outboard motors churning the gray water into a frantic white wake. The Iranian commanders were betting on the fog and the Bataan's reduced mobility to allow them to enter the inner defensive circle before the Americans could coordinate a response. On the flight deck of the Bataan, the crew scrambled to man the heavy machine gun positions and the 25mm Mark 38 chain guns. The sailors, wearing their ballistic helmets and heavy body armor, peered into the mist with thermal optics, searching for the heat signatures of the approaching engines. The air was cold and damp, and the spray from the bow was whipped into their faces by the wind. The ship's list, while improved, still made the footing treacherous on the wet, non-skid surface of the deck. The USS Mason moved to intercept, its tactical action officer ordering the ship to a high alert status. The destroyer veered away from the Bataan's flank, its engines screaming as it accelerated to 35 knots, to place itself directly in the path of the northern arm of the swarm. The communication channels were a steady stream of tactical coordinates and target assignments, the American crews remaining calm and methodical despite the rapid closing speed of the enemy. The rules of engagement had been clearly established. Any vessel crossing the 5-kilometer exclusion zone without authorization was to be treated as a hostile threat and engaged with lethal force. At 7 in the morning, the lead Iranian craft fired a salvo of 12.7mm machine gun rounds toward the Mason, the tracers cutting through the fog like red needles. The bullets splashed harmlessly into the sea hundreds of meters short of the ship, but the intent was clear. The swarm was not retreating. It was testing the perimeter. Behind the lead boats, the larger missile-armed fast attack craft began to slew their launchers into position, waiting for a clear radar lock through the electronic jamming being projected by the American strike group. The mist began to thin slightly as the wind picked up, revealing the jagged silhouettes of the Iranian boats as they bounced over the swells. They were small, aggressive shapes of gray and green, their crews visible through the spray as they gripped the rails of their tossing vessels. The standoff was over. The strike group commander issued the order to defend the Bataan at all costs, and the defensive systems of the Mason and the Bataan began to transition from surveillance to active engagement. The stage was set for a brutal, close-quarters confrontation in the gray light of the Arabian morning. 7:15 in the morning, on the 8th of March, 2026, the morning mist was shredded by the raw, mechanical power of a strike group pushed to the brink. At coordinates 18 degrees 35 minutes north, 62 degrees 5 minutes east, the Iranian fast attack swarm reached the 3-kilometer threshold. The air was no longer cold. It was baked by the friction of thousands of rounds of ammunition and the chemical heat of missile propellant. The USS Mason and the USS Bataan were no longer separate entities, but a single, interlocking wall of steel and fire. The engagement was no longer a standoff. It was a massacre of high-speed fiberglass by high-velocity tungsten. The trigger was squeezed. On the port side of the USS Bataan, the Phalanx close-in weapon system erupted with a sound like a giant chainsaw cutting through a sheet of metal. A continuous, white-hot stream of 20mm armor-piercing rounds reached out and touched the lead Iranian craft, a Boghammer fast attack boat. The impact was instantaneous and total. The high-density rounds punched straight through the fiberglass hull and into the outboard motors, which disintegrated into a cloud of shrapnel and black smoke. The boat did not just stop. It was hammered into the water, its bow rising vertically, before the fuel tanks erupted in a massive orange fireball that scorched the surface of the sea. The Defender reacted with a desperate, final surge. The remaining 15 Iranian craft split their formation, zigzagging at 50 knots to evade the tracking sensors. One craft, armed with a C-701 anti-ship missile, managed to lock onto the Bataan superstructure and fired. The missile shrieked off the rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the salt spray. But the Mason's Mark 45 5-inch gun was already calibrated. The turret slewed with predatory speed, firing a proximity-fused high-explosive shell that detonated 10 meters in front of the incoming missile. The blast wave tore the missile's guidance fins away, sending the warhead spiraling into a wave 300 meters from the Bataan's hull, where it exploded harmlessly in a 200-foot geyser of white foam. The USS Mason then turned its full attention to the main body of the swarm. The destroyer's 25mm chain guns and 12.7mm machine guns opened a synchronized fire, creating a crossfire that turned the water into a boiling cauldron of lead and spray. A second fast attack craft was hit mid-turn. The rounds severed the fuel lines, and the vessel came apart in a single white flash, sending debris flying 500 feet across the water. The heat blast from the explosion washed across the faces of the sailors on the Mason's deck, a searing reminder of the lethality of the exchange. Black smoke rose from the wreckage of 12 boats still settling into the sea. The burning pieces were still above water when the radio channels of the enemy formation went silent for exactly 3 seconds, then erupted in overlapping voices, each one louder than the last as the survivors broke formation and fled toward the northern horizon. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the crackle of the burning oil slicks and the steady, low-frequency hum of the Bataan's remaining power generators. The swarm had been shredded, leaving only a graveyard of scorched fiberglass and the bitter smell of defeat behind them. 9 in the morning, on the 8th of March, 2026, the Arabian Sea was now fully illuminated by a harsh, tropical sun that beat down on the oil-streaked water with relentless intensity. The mist had evaporated, replaced by a shimmering heat haze that made the horizon dance and blur. The USS Bataan, still under tow by the USNS Apache, moved through the waves with a heavy, rhythmic wallow, but the black smoke that had dominated the earlier hours had been replaced by thin, wispy trails of white steam. The immediate violence of the morning had passed, leaving behind a profound, exhausted quiet that was felt in every compartment of the strike group. Deep within the ship's hull, in the main machinery room, the engineering department was engaged in a desperate battle for mechanical restoration. The air in the lower decks was stifling, reaching temperatures of 110 degrees and thick with the smell of hot grease, diesel, and salt. The chief engineer, his coveralls soaked with sweat and hydraulic fluid, coordinated the effort to bypass the damaged electrical switchboards near the impact site. Using heavy-duty jumper cables the thickness of a man's arm, the technicians worked to restore auxiliary power to the primary steering gear and the remaining fire pumps. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, a cheer echoed through the machinery spaces as the auxiliary generators roared to life. The sound was a steady, mechanical thrum that brought with it the return of forced air ventilation and the hum of the ship's internal cooling systems. On the bridge, the dimmed consoles flickered back to life, the green and amber lights of the navigation displays providing the first real tactical picture. While the main propulsion remained offline due to the warped drive shafts, the restoration of auxiliary power meant the Bataan was no longer a dead ship in the water. The strike group commander adjusted the transit plan to account for the Bataan's limited maneuverability. The USS Mason moved into a screening position 2,000 meters ahead of the tow, its sonar domes continuously pinging the depths. The transit toward a secure port in the United Arab Emirates would take 3 days at the current speed of 6 knots, requiring a constant state of high alert. The logistics of the transit were calculated with the USNS Arctic remaining on the southern flank to provide continuous support. On the flight deck, crews were using high-pressure hoses to wash away the soot and the blood, the water running red and black into the scuppers. The twisted metal of the hangar deck had been stabilized with heavy steel shoring, and the remaining aircraft had been lashed down with double the usual amount of chains. Despite the exhaustion etched into their faces, the sailors worked with a quiet, grim efficiency, dictated by a decade of training. By 10 in the morning, the wounded giant had found its rhythm, the massive steel hawser taut and glistening in the sun pulling 40,000 tons of steel. The strike group was a singular, focused machine, moving away from the hostile coast and toward the sanctuary of a deep-water repair facility. The battle for the ship's survival had been won in the dark, and now, under the glare of the morning sun, the long road to recovery had officially begun. At 11 in the morning, on the 8th of March, 2026, in the secure, underground bunkers of United States Central Command in Tampa, Florida. The atmosphere was one of clinical, high-stakes analysis. The giant digital maps that spanned the walls of the operations center showed the Arabian Sea in vivid detail, with the blue icons of the Bataan Amphibious Ready Group moving slowly, but steadily away from the Iranian coast. The initial chaos of the tactical engagement had been replaced by a strategic overview as senior analysts and flag officers synthesized the data streaming in from satellites, high-altitude reconnaissance drones, and the ships themselves. HAMs. The strategic assessment was clear. The strike group had successfully navigated a complex, multi-layered ambush. The Iranian offensive, which had utilized a combination of ballistic missiles, one-way attack drones, and fast attack surface craft, had failed to achieve its primary objective of sinking a major United States naval asset. While the USS Bataan had sustained significant damage and the loss of 12 personnel, the ship's ability to remain afloat and restore auxiliary power was a testament to the effectiveness of American damage control and structural engineering. More importantly, the retaliatory strikes conducted by the F-35 Bravo jets had effectively neutralized the regional threat corridor. The report issued by Central Command at 11:30 in the morning highlighted the total destruction of the mobile missile battery in Hormozgan Province. The 2 Fateh 110 launchers, along with their associated command and control vehicles and ammunition supplies, had been completely obliterated. This move had effectively silenced the coastal battery that posed the greatest threat to the international shipping lanes in the Gulf of Oman. Furthermore, the destruction of 12 Iranian fast attack craft and 30 attack drones had significantly degraded the regional adversary's ability to conduct swarm operations for the foreseeable future. The threat corridor, a 50-mile wide stretch of water along the northern Arabian Sea, was now being patrolled by 2 additional Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that had been diverted from the side Mediterranean. These ships, the USS Carney and the USS Winston S. Churchill, were now conducting intensive electronic surveillance and anti-submarine patrols to ensure the safe passage of the Bataan and the accompanying logistics vessels. The presence of these additional assets served as a clear message of de-escalation through superior force, signaling that any further attempts to interfere with the strike group would be met with an immediate and overwhelming response. Inside the briefing rooms, the discussion turned toward the long-term implications of the engagement. The use of the Fateh 110 ballistic missile against a moving naval target represented a significant shift in regional capabilities, one that would require a re-evaluation of defensive protocols for all amphibious-ready groups. However, the performance of the Aegis combat system and the Sea Sparrow interceptors on the USS Mason had proven that the current technology was more than capable of handling high-velocity threats, provided the response was initiated within seconds of launch. The neutralization of the threat corridor was not just a military victory. It was a psychological one. The Iranian forces had committed a significant portion of their regional assets to a coordinated strike and had been repelled with heavy losses. The United States Navy had demonstrated that even when a ship is crippled by a direct hit, the surrounding strike group possesses the resilience and the firepower to protect the asset and deliver a crushing counterblow. The strategic map now showed a clear, sanitized lane for the Bataan's transit, a blue line cutting through the gray uncertainty of the morning's battle. By 12 in the afternoon, the initial summary report was finalized and transmitted to the Pentagon and the White House. The conclusion was professional and direct. The carrier strike group had maintained operational integrity under fire. The Bataan was damaged but defiant. The Mason was rearmed and on station, and the enemy's offensive capability in the sector had been reduced to zero. The mission had transitioned from combat to escort, but the eyes of the world remained fixed on the slow, determined progress of the American fleet as it moved toward the horizon. At 1 in the afternoon on the 8th of March, 2026, the sun reached its zenith over the Arabian Sea, casting a harsh, unyielding light on the scarred hull of the USS Bataan. The ship, once a pristine symbol of American maritime strength, now wore the black char and jagged steel of a survivor. The air was still and heavy, the only sound the rhythmic creaking of the towing hawser and the distant, reassuring hum of the USS Mason's engines as it maintained its protective station. On the bridge of the Bataan, the commanding officer sat in the quiet of a restored command center, reviewing the final damage and casualty report that would define this engagement in the annals of naval history. The tally of the damage was severe but calculated. The Fateh 110 missile had detonated with a force that had ruptured 3 internal bulkheads and destroyed over 2,000 square meters of hangar deck space. 3 MH-60 Sierra helicopters and 2 F-35 Bravo jets were listed as total losses, their airframes reduced to twisted skeletons of titanium and carbon fiber. The port side hull bore a 10-meter scar where the sea continued to lap against the steel shoring. Yet, the ship's primary systems, the nuclear reactors, the auxiliary power grid, and the vertical launch cells remained operational. The USS Bataan had taken a heavyweight blow and remained in the fight, a testament to the thousands of hours of damage control training invested in her crew. The human cost was the most heavy. 12 United States sailors were confirmed killed in action, their names recorded for the final notification of kin. 38 others remained under intensive medical care, with several facing a long recovery from the searing heat of the initial fireball. In a brief ceremony on the flight deck at 1400 hours, the crew stood at attention as the national ensign was raised to full staff, a silent salute to those who had fallen in the dark hours of the morning. There was no triumphalism in the air, only the somber, focused resolve of professionals who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. The strategic summary was a stark contrast to the American losses. The Iranian Regional Command had suffered a catastrophic failure of its offensive doctrine. In exchange for damaging a single American ship, they had lost 2 mobile ballistic missile launchers, 30 advanced attack drones, and 12 fast attack craft. More importantly, the precision of the F-35 Bravo counterstrike had decapitated the local command and control nodes, leaving the coastal defense network in a state of total disarray. The threat corridor was no longer a contested space. It was a graveyard of Iranian ambition, now monitored by a reinforced American presence that had doubled in size within 6 hours of the first launch. The USS Bataan's transit continued at a steady 6 knots. The sight of the ship, trailing a thin plume of steam but moving with purpose, sent a clear message to the watching world. The United States Navy had proven that its capital ships are not fragile targets, but resilient fortresses capable of absorbing the worst an adversary can throw and returning the blow with surgical finality. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, the strike group moved further into the safety of the international shipping lanes, the blue water of the Arabian Sea washing away the last traces of the morning's blood and soot. The incident would be analyzed for years in military academies, a study in ballistic missile defense, swarm saturation, and the indomitable spirit of naval damage control. But for the sailors of the Bataan and the Mason, the reality was much simpler. They had survived, they had held the line, and they were going home. The screen on the Central Command monitor shifted the Bataan status from engaged to in transit, the blue icon moving slowly but surely toward a secure horizon. The Battle of the Arabian Sea was over.